He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't ask for a second chance. He just wanted to see his dog one last time. But when the warden approved the request and the dog was brought into that cold concrete cell, something happened that no one, not even the guards, was prepared for. A moment so strange, so emotionally jarring, that one of the prison nurses would later whisper, "It's like the dog knew something and was trying to tell us." What did the dog do that froze everyone in place? And why, after that final visit, was the execution postponed indefinitely? This is the story of James Weller, inmate number 34,629. And the dog who wouldn't let him die. James Weller wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to see behind bars. A decorated firefighter, twice awarded for bravery, a father, a husband, someone who had once run into a burning building to save a child, only to be accused, years later, of a crime that set the internet on fire. But by the time we meet him, he's 37 years old, wearing an orange jumpsuit, walking a narrow hallway toward death row. The guards don't speak. The cameras follow every step. And James, he's not crying, not shouting. Just one request on his lips. "Can I see Max one last time?" Max, his golden retriever, the only soul who'd visited him in his darkest hours, and the one creature who'd been with him the night of the fire. Yes, there was a fire. A child did die. And the evidence? Well, the media made sure everyone saw that grainy footage of James running from the scene, covered in soot, holding something tight to his chest. But here's where things get complicated, because Max the dog had disappeared the same night. According to Dr. Evelyn Grant, a former behavioral specialist with the FBI who reviewed James's psychological profile, the attachment between James and Max bordered on pathological. For James, Max wasn't just a peeve, was the last tether to a life before trauma. And that trauma didn't start in the courtroom. It started years earlier, in a house filled with secrets, silence, and the faint smell of gasoline. We'll get to that. But for now, picture this. A death row inmate, 3 days from execution. No family visits. No final phone call. Just one simple request. "Let me see my dog." And the prison approved it. Which almost never happens. Why? According to Warden Felix Morgan, it wasn't mercy. It was protocol. James had saved the life of a fellow inmate months earlier. The board granted his last request as a gesture of human dignity. But they had no idea what was coming. When the dog arrived, everything shifted. A prison nurse, Carla Monroe, later described it this way. The moment Max entered the room, James dropped to his knees, but the dog didn't run to him. He froze, stared, then did something I've never seen before. Max turned his head slowly and looked directly at one of the guards. Then, without a single bark or growl, the dog walked past James and sat in front of that guard. Refused to move, refused to blink, refused to let anyone come close. And then he started whining, a low, haunting sound that echoed through the chamber. It was like he was pointing at something, or someone. Within hours, the execution was postponed. The guard in question was placed on leave, and the entire prison was put under internal review. But no one, not the warden, not the investigators, not even James would speak to the press. Until now. Because what Max revealed wasn't just about that night. It was about what had really happened inside that house. What James had been hiding, and why the evidence never made sense. And what we uncovered is something no one ever expected. Not even James himself. To understand what really happened that night, we have to go back 11 years, to a house on Millstone Drive, to a little boy with a secret, and a dog who had been trained to smell more than just smoke 11 years earlier. A different life. A different James. A warm house on Millstone Drive, the smell of baked bread, and a golden retriever puppy gnawing on the corner of the welcome mat. It was the kind of scene that belonged in a holiday card. James had just come home from a 24-hour shift at the firehouse. His wife, Emily, met him at the door with their toddler in her arms, eyes tired but kind. And Max? Max leapt into his lap the moment he sat down, as if the two had been separated for years. But under that perfect picture was a truth no one saw coming. The fire happened on a Monday. James had been working a back-to-back shift. Emily had taken their son to visit her sister. The house was empty, or so they thought. But a neighbor called 911 at 2:43 a.m. Smoke, flames, a child's scream. When James got the call, he was only 3 miles away. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't wait for protocol. He drove straight there. When first responders arrived, the house was already half collapsed. The flames had consumed the living room and were licking their way up the staircase. James was seen running into the house without gear, without oxygen. What he came out with was Max. Soot-covered, barely breathing, but alive. That's when the problems began. There was no child found inside, but there was a child missing, a 9-year-old boy named Caleb Jensen. Not James's son, not even a family friend. But somehow, the child's scent was all over the guest bedroom. According to fire investigator Lionel Vance, there was no reason for a child to be there, no toys, no bed, but the dog kept circling that room, scratching the closet door, and we did find traces of blood. And this is when James became a suspect. The media was relentless. Hero turned killer? Firefighter hides a sinister secret? The fact that James had rescued his dog and not the child. They used that to crucify him. But what the media didn't know, what James never told anyone, was that Max had been trained. He wasn't just a companion. He was a K9 certified search dog. A dog trained to identify accelerants. A dog who barked twice for blood, once for gasoline. And on that night, in that burning house, Max had barked 3 times, then went completely silent. Why did James never say that in court? Why did he refuse to testify in his own defense? According to Emily's sworn statement, James told her, "If I talk, more people get hurt." But who was he protecting? Caleb's parents? The fire department? Someone inside the system? No one knows. All we know is this. After the fire, Max disappeared. Vanished. Until the day James was moved to death row, and the dog showed up again. It was a retired firefighter named Tom Grayson who brought Max back. He claimed he'd found the dog wandering behind an abandoned warehouse, scars across his back, underweight and trembling at every sound. When asked why he thought it was James's dog, Tom said, "Because the moment I whistled, he came limping over and dropped a burnt collar at my feet. The tag was melted, but I could still read it. Max Millstone Drive." Why did Max disappear that night? Why did he come back 11 years later? And most important, what did he see inside that house? Because if Max had been trained to detect accelerants and blood, and if he responded that night, then James may not have been running from guilt, but from someone else who was still inside. Someone Max smelled. Someone Max remembered. Someone Max recognized in that prison chamber 11 years later. And that's why the dog didn't run to James. That's why he stared down the guard. That's why everything changed the moment he entered the room. Because this isn't just about a man on death row. This is about the person Max didn't go to. His name was Caleb Jensen, 9 years old, quiet, withdrawn, often seen standing alone at recess, watching the other kids play but never joining in. To most people, he was just that boy from the foster system. One of many. One more case file collecting dust in the cabinet of a broken system. But to James, Caleb was something else entirely. Because months before the fire, Caleb had appeared in James's life under circumstances so bizarre, so emotionally complex, that even now, no one is sure why James never told the full story. It started with a knock on the door. James and Emily were sitting down for dinner when a woman from Child Protective Services arrived unannounced holding a clipboard and a frightened boy in oversized shoes. Her name was Marla Quinn. According to her report, Caleb had been placed in a temporary home nearby, but the placement had fallen through. The agency was overloaded. They had nowhere else to place him. And James and Emily were listed as emergency backup foster candidates due to a volunteer application James had filled out years earlier after responding to a house fire involving 2 neglected children. James didn't remember applying, but Emily said yes. Caleb barely spoke. He would sit on the couch, arms wrapped around his knees, and stare blankly at the wall. Every time Max came near him, he would flinch, refuse to eat unless the lights were on, refuse to sleep unless the closet door was open. Emily tried. She read stories, left nightlights on, even placed a small stuffed dog on his bed to ease the tension. But James connected with him differently. He didn't speak to Caleb like a child. He spoke to him like a survivor, because James knew the signs. He had seen them before, in the eyes of children pulled from the ashes of domestic hell. Children who never screamed. Children who were taught to be invisible. Then came the incident. It was mid-July. Emily had taken their son to visit her parents. James was alone with Caleb and Max. According to the police report, a neighbor heard screaming and called 911. When officers arrived, Caleb was crouched in the corner of the yard, shaking violently. Max was barking non-stop, and James had a bloodied hand. But no charges were filed. James claimed he cut his hand on a broken glass while chasing Max. Caleb said nothing, and the case was closed. But CPS removed Caleb from the home the next day. Where they placed him remains unclear. Some records indicate he was transferred to a different foster home across the state. Others suggest he simply vanished. Here's where the mystery deepens. In a sealed deposition uncovered years later, Marla Quinn admitted that Caleb's file contained inconsistencies. His medical records were incomplete. His birth certificate was missing. And there were no documented parental rights ever filed. In other words, Caleb may not have officially existed. So who was he? And why did Max, a trained detection dog, respond so violently to that guest bedroom on the night of the fire? Dr. Anna Patel, a trauma-informed psychologist specializing in child abuse cases, reviewed Caleb's behavior on video footage from the foster home. Her analysis? This wasn't simple neglect. Caleb displayed classic signs of complex trauma hypervigilance, dissociation, avoidance. But the most telling sign? He flinched when the dog approached. That suggests prior exposure to something connected with animals or detection work. Why would a child be afraid of a search dog? Unless he had something to hide, or worse, someone had trained him to avoid them. The final note from Dr. Patel is chilling. I don't think James was protecting Caleb. I think Caleb was protecting James, or someone else entirely. And Max? Max was the only one who knew the truth, because dogs don't forget scent. And they don't lie. Which brings us back to the prison. To Max staring down that guard. To the one person the dog refused to approach. That guard's name? Eric Langston, former EMT, transferred to the prison system in 2012. And once, a resident on Millstone Drive, 3 houses down from James Weller. Eric Langston, 38 years old, quiet, punctual, never missed a shift. To the other guards, he was a ghost always present, but never really there. But to Max, He wasn't just a guard. He was a memory. Because Eric Langston wasn't just assigned to death row, he had a past. And that past began on Millstone Drive, 3 houses away from James Weller's old home. The neighborhood was close-knit. Everyone knew each other. Barbecues in the summer. Sprinklers in the front yard. Bikes left on sidewalks. But behind Eric Langston's front door, things were different. There were no barbecues. No laughter. No visitors. Just Eric. And a foster boy. Records show Eric had been approved as a temporary guardian for an unnamed child in 2011. Duration: 2 months. Child's age: 9. There are no photographs. No medical reports. No school records. But one thing is clear. The time frame overlaps exactly with when Caleb Jensen appeared in James Weller's home. Could Eric have been Caleb's previous foster parent? Could the child have been transferred from one house to the next, carrying a secret no one wanted revealed? And if so, why did Caleb never speak about what happened in Eric's care? According to internal prison communications, Eric never requested death row assignment. He was placed there automatically due to staffing shortages. The day he started, the same day James Weller was transferred to that wing. Coincidence? Or fate? One prison psychologist, Dr. Michael Brenner, noticed something odd. Langston displayed dissociative traits, flat affect, strong reactions only in 2 situations, when confronted with sudden noise and when he heard the name, Max. When Max entered the death chamber, it wasn't just James he saw. It was Eric. And whatever he smelled, it triggered something ancient in the dog's memory. A scent. A trauma. A connection no one could have predicted. Let's go deeper. In 2012, Eric Langston filed a report for a missing pet. A golden retriever named Max. Same breed, same age, same description. But Eric claimed the dog had run away. No microchip, no collar found. According to a note in the report, owner stated dog was getting too aggressive. May have been given away unofficially. So Max was with Eric before he ever lived with James? Or was it a different Max? The timeline is murky. The records don't match. And no one seems to have noticed the duplication until now. What if Max was taken? What if he had been removed from Eric's home due to abuse, the same kind Caleb might have experienced? What if James found them both Caleb and Max and took them in, without understanding the full extent of their shared past? And what if, on the night of the fire, Max recognized a threat? Someone who had once hurt him, someone he was trained to signal. And that person was already inside the house. Eric never spoke about Caleb, never acknowledged knowing James, never reacted until the dog walked in. Then, he froze. Security footage confirms it. When Max entered the chamber, Eric's heart rate spiked. He stepped back, dropped the clipboard in his hand, refused to make eye contact with the dog. And Max? He didn't just sit in front of Eric. He growled. Low. Controlled. Targeted. The prison paused the execution. They said it was due to technical concerns. But the truth? Internal memos show that after Max's reaction, a request was filed for psychological evaluation of Langston. And he disappeared from his post 2 days later. Resigned. No forwarding address. No contact. Gone. But the mystery was just beginning. Because inside Eric's locker, they found something no one could explain. A single photograph. Old. Burned at the edges. It showed a child, blurry, standing in a field, with Max, and in the corner, scribbled in pen. He never should have remembered. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Every camera aimed at James Weller like a hunter eyeing its kill. He sat at the defense table in silence. Not defiant. Not angry. Just empty. And across the room, an entire wall of press badges and lenses waited for the moment they could label him forever. Firefighter, father, killer. But what if that trial so clean, so convincing was built on something rotten? What if the truth didn't make it into the courtroom? What if the jury never saw the one piece of evidence that could have changed everything? Let's go back. James was arrested 2 days after the fire. The charge: manslaughter and arson with intent to conceal a crime. The victim? Listed as Caleb Jensen, age unknown. Yes, unknown. Even the prosecution admitted there was no legal record of the boy's existence. But they argued that James had invented Caleb to cover for something else. Their theory? That James had relapsed into a mental breakdown. That his trauma from years of firefighting had driven him to create a ghost child, fabricate a victim, and then set the fire to cover a psychological collapse. Their case hinged on 3 things: footage of James running from the house carrying Max, blood traces found in the guest room closet, and a burned photograph found in the rubble with James, Emily, and a blurred-out child identity unknown. But here's what they didn't tell the jury: that the photo was never carbon-dated, that the blood was never matched to anyone, that Max the trained detection dog was never mentioned in the trial. Why? Because Max had vanished. And without him, the defense had nothing. The lead prosecutor, Mason Delroy, built his case around the idea of a man cracking under pressure. In his closing argument, he said, "James Weller was once a hero, but heroes fall, and when they do, they take others with them." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. A court-appointed investigator, Leanne Mercer, filed a sealed report never released to the public. In it, she raised serious questions about the timeline of events. Her findings? That Caleb may have been part of a witness protection program connected to a separate federal investigation. That his CPS file had been accessed and altered by someone outside the system. That the house had 2 separate ignition points, suggesting intentional arson by a third party. And perhaps most damning, that prison guard Eric Langston's name appeared in the visitor logs of the CPS office 2 days before Caleb was placed in James's care. Why was none of this admitted into evidence? Because the report was deemed speculative and excluded during pre-trial motions. The judge said it would confuse the jury and distract from the central charge. But what if that was the central charge? What if James wasn't protecting himself? What if he was protecting Caleb? There was one more thing. Buried deep in a folder labeled Suppressed Exhibits was a voice recording. It was short, 32 seconds. Never played in court. It was taken from the body cam of the first firefighter on the scene. In it, you hear the roar of flames, the sound of Max barking, and then, faintly, a child's voice. He said not to tell. He said we'd both burn. And then, static. Why was this never heard by the jury? Why did James's defense attorney never mention it? Because 2 weeks before the trial, that attorney resigned. Citing a conflict of interest, he was replaced by a public defender with only 48 hours to prepare. Coincidence? Or sabotage? And now 11 years later, James Weller is on death row, convicted based on a narrative crafted from silence, fear, and the absence of a dog who finally came back. But with Max's return, everything changes. Because Max didn't just stare down Eric Langston. He led investigators to something buried beneath the prison chapel, a place no one had entered in over a decade. What they found there rewrites everything we thought we knew. The prison chapel was rarely used. Dust settled on the pews. The Bibles were sun-faded. and the air always seemed colder than anywhere else inside those concrete walls. But Max kept returning to it. After his confrontation with Eric Langston, prison officials noticed something strange. Every time Max was brought through the main corridor for supervised visits, he would pause at the side hallway, the hallway that led to the old chapel. He wouldn't bark. He wouldn't growl. He'd just stop and stare. Then, after a few seconds, he'd try to pull away from his handler toward the chapel door. At first, they thought it was coincidence, a smell, a memory. But after the third time, Warden Felix Morgan approved a search. The chapel was locked, unused since a flood damaged its flooring years earlier. They opened the door. Max walked in, straight down the aisle, stopped behind the altar, and sat. Then, he scratched the floor 4 times. Prison maintenance removed the loose floorboards. Beneath them was a narrow crawl space, maybe 3 feet deep, running beneath the foundation of the room. Dirt, stone, old water lines, and something else. A small, rusted lockbox sealed, corroded by time, but intact. They pulled it out, opened it. Inside were 3 items: a charred photograph, a folded letter, and a child's drawing gidged, stained, torn at the edges. The photograph was the same as the one entered into evidence during James's trial, except this version was uncropped. It showed James, Emily, and Caleb. But this time, another person stood at the edge of the frame, half cut off, barely visible, but unmistakable. Eric Langston. The folded letter was handwritten, signed J.W. But the contents weren't a confession. They were a plea. If anything happens, if they find this, Caleb was never safe. I tried to get him out. Max knows who hurt him. Please don't let this be buried. Dated 2 days before the fire. And the drawing? Crude. Stick figures. A red house. Flames at the top. One figure stood outside with a dog. Another was drawn inside, behind black scribbles. Beside it, a tall figure in a grey shirt, holding something in its hand. The name Caleb was written in shaky block letters at the top. Why were these things hidden under a chapel? Why not taken to the police? According to Dr. Evelyn Grant, former FBI profiler, victims of complex trauma often hide the truth in plain sight. James may have feared retaliation, not from the legal system, but from someone inside it. Hiding the box under the chapel, a space associated with safety, might have felt like the only way to preserve what he knew. Warden Morgan contacted the state attorney's office. An emergency review was launched, and for the first time in 11 years, James Weller was pulled from death row and placed in protective observation. When asked about the box, James stared at it in silence. Then he said, "I buried it so they couldn't bury him." They meaning who? The system? Langston? The people who placed Caleb into that house? One more thing. Hidden behind the photograph, pressed flat against the metal of the lockbox, was a memory card. It was damaged, nearly unreadable, but forensic techs were able to recover one file. A video, grainy, no sound, timestamped 2 days before the fire. It shows the inside of James's living room. Caleb is sitting on the couch. Max is lying beside him. The front door opens. Caleb flinches, and a man walks in. Tall, grey shirt, face turned away from the camera. But his tattoo is visible. A distinctive black and red cross. The same tattoo Eric Langston has on his forearm. That video never made it to court. That tattoo was never mentioned. But now, everything points to Langston. And Langston? He's gone. Disappeared. No digital trail. No credit card use. No family contact. As if someone wanted him off the map. But there's one more lead. One more person who may know the full truth about Caleb, Langston, and the night that fire lit up Millstone Drive. A woman who vanished just days after Caleb was placed into foster care. Her name? Marla Quinn, the social worker who brought Caleb to James's door. And as of last week, she's been found. She hadn't used her real name in over a decade. No digital footprint. No driver's license renewal. No tax records. To the world, Marla Quinn had vanished. But she wasn't dead. She was hiding. And now, 11 years after placing Caleb Jensen in James Weller's home, she had been found living under an alias in a small coastal town in Oregon. A social worker turned ghost. And when investigators approached her, she didn't ask how they found her. She didn't run. She simply said, "It was never supposed to reach James. He wasn't supposed to be involved." They brought her in quietly. No press, no cameras. And for the first time, Marla told the full story. Caleb wasn't just another foster child. He was part of an internal witness protection program designed for minors who had been exploited by state officials, a program so secret, even CPS caseworkers didn't know the full scope. According to Marla, Caleb had been pulled from a home run by a former firefighter with deep ties to emergency services. That man was Eric Langston. Marla had been assigned to extract Caleb from the Langston home after reports of inappropriate training exercises and extreme behavioral control. What she found, she said, was worse. He wasn't raising Caleb. He was conditioning him, making him freeze on command, making him lie still in small spaces. It was like the boy was being trained for something. But when she filed the report, it was flagged. Buried. Instead of terminating Langston's license, the agency reassigned Caleb to a new address. James Weller's, W1. Why James? Because his name was in the system. Because he had once volunteered to foster a burn victim after a rescue. Because he had passed the background check, but he wasn't supposed to receive that child. The transfer was meant to be temporary, just a holding placement. They told me Caleb would be moved again in 72 hours, but after I dropped him off, I was told to forget it, to erase the file, to walk away. And so she did. Until the fire. When the news broke that a child had died in James's home, Marla tried to come forward. But she was warned. Not by strangers, by people inside the department. She received calls with no voice, letters with no return address, and finally, a package on her doorstep. Inside, a charred dog collar, and a note. Stay buried, like the rest of them. So she ran. Now, sitting before a team of federal investigators, Marla confirmed what many had feared, that the system designed to protect Caleb had placed him back into danger, and that James Weller was never the threat. He was the one who tried to save the boy. But there was one more truth. A piece of the puzzle even Marla didn't know until she saw the photograph recovered from the chapel. The uncropped version. The one that showed James, Emily, Caleb, and Langston in the background. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "That wasn't the first time they crossed paths." According to archived emergency logs, James Weller had responded to a house fire in 2009. A fire that claimed the life of a woman and left one survivor, a 6-year-old boy. That boy was never identified publicly, but Marla recognized the address. It was one of Langston's former homes. And the boy was Caleb, which means Langston had reclaimed custody under a false identity, trained the boy for years, then lost him again. And when Caleb ended up in James's house, Langston followed. He wasn't just a bystander. He was in the house the night of the fire. The final confirmation came from Max. After returning to the chapel crawlspace, the dog unearthed one final item buried deeper beneath the concrete. A firefighter's badge. Corroded. Scratched. And on the back, a serial number. It matched Eric Langston's original ID before he changed it and re-entered the system under a new name. The same badge he claimed was lost in the flood. With all evidence presented, the court ruled to overturn James Weller's conviction. He was released after 11 years on death row. He did not speak to the press. He did not appear on television. He returned to a quiet home, far from Millstone Drive, where one's soul waited for him at the gate. Max. But the story doesn't end there. Because 2 weeks after James's release, a fire broke out in a cabin 2 states away. The cause? Arson. One body found inside. Burned beyond recognition. No ID. But next to the remains, a melted photograph of a young boy, a golden retriever, and a man with a red and black tattoo.